Good evening, I'm Jim Waley. Tonight we're looking back over a remarkable year. Who would have guessed when 1982 began that the tiny Falkland Islands would overshadow world trouble spots such as Afghanistan, El Salvador and the Gulf conflict between Iraq and Iran. Initially there was a Gilbert and Sullivan air about the territorial dispute between Argentina and Britain. But when both sides went to war, it became deadly serious.
To the South Atlantic! Quick march!
The British response to an invasion, first by scrap metal dealers, then by Argentine troops, on a windswept island group many Britons didn't even know existed. But it was their sovereign territory, with a unique community of 1,800 more British than the British. So Britain set sail for war, 13,000 kilometres away, the country's finest hour 40 years on.
Failure? Do you remember what Queen Victoria once said? Failure? The possibilities do not exist.
Economic sanctions, shuttle diplomacy and a 300-kilometre no-go zone around the Falklands failed to stall war. Britain invaded, first the outer islands, then bombing the main airstrip at the tiny capital, Port Stanley. The ugly stain of war spread to sea. First victim, the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano, with more than 1,000 men aboard. Next it was Britain's most advanced destroyer, the Sheffield, crippled by an Exocet missile. Both sides lost planes, the British a frigate, the Ardent. 5,000 British troops established beachheads on the two main Falkland Islands. On land, the Argentines were routed, but at sea and in Falkland Sound, the Argentine Air Force hit home with embarrassing accuracy. Then there was Bluff Cove, the deaths of Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram. Within a week of this tragic setback, strategic hills had been recaptured and Port Stanley was once more British.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood.
1,000 lives, several $1 billion, and 10 weeks after it started, the battle for the Falklands was over. Argentina's president, Galtieri, was ousted. But after the last body was buried and British rejoicing subsided, Argentina still had not agreed to end hostilities, and the issue of long-term sovereignty over the islands is still not settled. While the world was watching the deadly struggle being conducted in the South Atlantic, a new flashpoint erupted in the Middle East. Early in June, Israeli tanks and troops rolled into southern Lebanon, a savage military onslaught that surprised Israel's friends and foes alike and put her traditional alliances at risk.
Israeli hawks needed little excuse to pounce on Lebanon. They cited PLO attacks on northern Israel as the reason for their invasion early in June. The announced objective was to clean out the guerrillas from a 40-kilometre zone between the Israeli border and the Litani River. But the blitzkrieg soon enveloped Beirut itself. The bloody siege dragged on for weeks, until Lebanese and American negotiators stitched together an agreement that forced the PLO to abandon Beirut. At least 19,000 people, Lebanese and Palestinians, died in the fighting, 7,000 in the ravaged capital. And when the war, but not the peace, was won, Israeli forces stood by while Christian militiamen carried out a senseless massacre in the Shatila and Sabra refugee camps. Israel's friends and allies, even the Israelis themselves, were enraged over the magnitude of the slaughter. An ongoing inquiry has cast a shadow over the careers of both Prime Minister Begin and Defence Minister Sharon. But for Israel, the objective of a secure northern border has been achieved, and the PLO dispersed across a sometimes unwilling Arab world. After the murder of his brother, Amin Gemayel is charged with establishing Lebanese independence. The tenuous peace now held together with the help of troops from America, France and Italy. But the Palestinian question remains unresolved, a potential source of conflict for the year to come.
Debate over the nuclear arms race reached a crescendo in 1982. President Reagan committed the United States to the controversial MX missile program and now faces a battle for funding. America and the Soviet Union did agree to begin strategic arms reduction talks, but they might take years to produce results. And there could be equally long-term effects on US-Soviet relations following the death in November of 75-year-old Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev had ruled Russia for 18 years, guiding the Kremlin on a course that alternated between détente and confrontation with the West. He dealt with 5 different American presidents. The Soviets looked for a successor and chose 68-year-old Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB, and a man who shows signs of easing the hardline attitude towards the West that characterized the twilight years of the ailing Brezhnev. In Poland, Brezhnev's death coincided with news that Lech Walesa, hero of the free trade union movement, was being released after 11 months in detention. During 1982, support for the banned Solidarity Union was continually crushed by the military regime. 15 demonstrators died and more than 10,000 Poles spent some time in internment. The year ends with martial law being eased, Warsaw authorities promising an eventual return to civilian rule, but not the heady days of reform that Solidarity stood for. Poland's troubles prevented Pope John Paul returning to his homeland during 1982. But he remained the most travelled pontiff, Africa early in the year, then Portugal, and an unforgettable week in Britain, almost curtailed by the Falklands War. Church unity never seemed more possible than during this embrace between John Paul and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Later, a stroll to reflect on the significance of their historic encounter. John Paul travelled on to Argentina, again carrying a message of peace to one of the Falklands rivals. And to wind up a busy year, he found himself in Spain, watching this amazing ceremony in an ancient cathedral. This was the year when unemployment and recession became catchwords, and economic statistics made ever more depressing headlines. Unemployment in America soared to 12 million, in Britain 3.25 million, and in Australia, at last estimate, well over 500,000. At year's end, Australia's political leaders are putting their faith in a wages freeze and looking for signs of improvement in the US economy that would have a flow-on here. Through Prime Minister Fraser, Australia put forward a proposition early in the year designed to stimulate the world economy. In meetings with President Reagan and the leaders of Canada, Japan and Korea, he argued that trade barriers had to be eased. Protectionism was stifling growth. It was a policy that had little effect at the Versailles Economic Summit in June or later at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Conference. No one seemed ready to take the gamble. The recession, meanwhile, claimed some high flyers. Freddie Laker's cheap fares SkyTrain operation between Britain, Europe and the United States. It crashed in February. The American airline Braniff collapsed in May. Israel's El Al also folded, and most other airlines were in the ring. Qantas didn't escape, calling for 1,000 voluntary retrenchments. But here in Australia, the crash of '82 was most apparent in manufacturing industries, particularly steel. As BHP cut production or closed plants altogether, thousands of workers were laid off at Whyalla in South Australia and Newcastle and Port Kembla in New South Wales. Not all of them went willingly. 30 miners on the New South Wales south coast staged an underground protest for 16 days at the Camiro colliery. Colleagues marched on Parliament House, demanding government intervention and more protection against steel imports. In unprecedented scenes, they smashed down the doors of Parliament House. Violence flared again during a protest over unemployment in November, when demonstrators tried to invade the elite Melbourne club. By year's end, jobs were being lost at the rate of more than 1,000 a day. State premiers went to Canberra for what was billed as an economic summit. The result, an uneasy compromise on a wages freeze and some $300 million in federal funds for job creation programs in 1983. Adding to Australia's gloomy economic climate was the climate itself. Drought, the worst this century, wiped out much of the wheat crop, depriving already depressed rural communities of an estimated $1 billion. In addition, the federal government is up for massive payouts in fodder and interest rate subsidies to farmers. One reason why the 1982-83 deficit has blown out to more than $4 billion and could go even higher. In Canberra, it was a year of anguish, challenges, much speculation and retirements. The last of the 49ers, Sir William McMahon, called it a day. Sir Zelman Cowen, who healed the wounds of the Kerr era, retired to Oxford, and a High Court judge, Sir Ninian Stephen, moved into Yarralumla. There was movement, too, in and out of the Fraser ministry. Health Minister Michael McKellar acted beyond the call of duty, customs duty that is, bringing a colour TV set into Australia tax-free. Business and Consumer Affairs Minister John Moore had conducted an inquiry into the incident, but took no action. There were hints of a cover-up. Both eventually retired hurt to the backbench. Andrew Peacock, already on the backbench, made a bid for the leadership.
Andrew Peacock's, been an ego tripper from way back, and every time there's not very much publicity, he throws a few crumbs, calls gully, 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 and throws a few crumbs to you.
The Prime Minister called a party meeting. The challenge was declared, but Peacock mustered only 27 votes to Fraser's 54.
That therefore means that there will be no further challenges.
At the same time, Treasurer John Howard replaced Sir Philip Lynch, who stood down as deputy leader. By July, it was Labour's turn.
Could the Labour Party win the next federal election with you as leader?
I think there's no doubt they could.
Bob Hawke was running, and his bid to topple Bill Hayden all but succeeded. Faction fighting between Labour's left and right split the party. Hayden survived by 5 votes, and the victor and the vanquished made up. Until next time. By mid-October, reconciliation too on the government benches. Andrew Peacock came in from the cold, taking over industry and commerce from Sir Philip Lynch, who retired ill. A softly budget renewed speculation that we were to have an early election, but any poll plans sank with the Costigan report, an inquiry which began with a trade union and soon widened to highlight a free-for-all tax rort, so-called bottom-of-the-harbour schemes. And the early election rumours were finally torpedoed when the Prime Minister needed surgery for a persistent back problem. It effectively put Mr. Fraser out of action for 2 months, a painful way to put off a painful decision. For the 3rd straight year, the story of baby Azaria Chamberlain made headlines worldwide. A coroner's inquest early in 1981 found Azaria had been taken by a dingo, but on February the 2nd this year, Lindy and Michael Chamberlain were back in Darwin to hear the outcome of a second investigation. It was to be a sensational verdict. This time, Coroner Jerry Galvin cleared the dingo and recommended that Lindy Chamberlain be charged with murdering the infant. Michael Chamberlain was charged as an accessory after the fact. The trial began in September, with Mrs. Chamberlain expecting her 4th child. After 7 weeks and a mountain of technical evidence about bloodstains, the jury of 9 men and 3 women presented their verdict. Lindy Chamberlain, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labour, the only punishment allowed under Northern Territory law. Husband Michael was also found guilty, but given a suspended sentence and released on a bond. In November, 3 days after the birth of her new daughter, Mrs. Chamberlain's lawyers succeeded with an application for bail. She is now free, back with her family in the seclusion of a Seventh-day Adventist college near Newcastle, waiting for the next chapter in this amazing saga, the appeal, which begins February 7th.
Don Seckham in Brisbane welcoming you to this special program. 1982 was, of course, the year of the Commonwealth Games, but there were plenty of other happenings to attract attention. We had a hailstorm which gave Mount Cootha an alpine look, an alleged Skyway robbery attempt to steal many thousands of dollars of reserve bank money, and another Bellevue situation which saw the early morning demolition of the Cloudland Ballroom. It was also a year of confrontation between the unions and the state government. The issue was supposedly a shorter working week, but many observers saw it as a sheer test of strength against the Bjelke-Petersen government and its emergency powers legislation. The confrontation brought no joy to the man in the street, as a series of stoppages in the transport and services industries in late July almost brought the state to a standstill. But although the union bosses failed to rally support for a general strike, they were quick to claim victory.
No, it's not round one to Joe. The workers throughout this state have had a tremendous victory.
The government had its internal problems as well. Allegations that a fact-finding tour of the Torres Strait Islands was nothing more than a fishing junket would eventually mean the replacement of two senior cabinet ministers, Vic Sullivan and Ken Tompkins. The opposition had its own problems. Before the end of October, Labour leader Ed Casey was to find himself deposed by Rockhampton lay preacher Keith Wright. It was a year of major changes, both on the opposition front bench and the government ministry. Then, as preparations for the Commonwealth Games swung into their final phase, Aboriginal land rights activists stepped up their campaign to make the best use of the Games as a forum for their cause. Hundreds of black activists took to the streets on the eve of the official opening of the Games. The organisers' timing was impeccable. News crews from around the world were on hand to record the march. The activists had a potential audience of 500 million TV viewers to hear their grievances. But the following day, September the 30th, Aboriginal land rights issues and the activists camped at Musgrave Park were forgotten as the Commonwealth Games officially got underway. It was a spectacle to stir even the most cynical observer. The land rights activists were not to be denied the opportunity to be heard during the Games. A sudden onslaught on the QE2 complex almost caught police off guard. There were more than 20 arrests. A ploy by demonstrators to enter the stadium with tickets failed. Then the most violent confrontation came on October the 7th, the day after the arrival of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. A demonstration began with a rally in the Roma Street Forum. Aboriginal Senator Neville Bonner was a casualty of the demonstration. His highly emotive plea to his people not to break the law by marching without a permit fell on deaf ears.
Don't tell me I'm not an Aborigine, because that is mine. That belongs to me.
The senator was almost trampled as he physically tried to restrain the demonstrators. In the clashes which followed, there were scores of arrests. They included the Governor-General's daughter, Anne Stephen. An ABC camera crew who failed to obey a police directive were also quickly seized by the long arm of the law. But any doubt as to the success of the Games was dispelled when competitors from the Commonwealth joined in a spirit of comradeship for the closing ceremony. And we might well applaud the sentiments of Her Majesty when she summed up the Brisbane Commonwealth Games in these terms in her Christmas message.
In a world more concerned with argument, disagreement and violence, the Games stand out as a demonstration of the better side of human nature and of the great value of the Commonwealth as an association of free and independent nations.
In sport, 1982 provided many triumphs. Tonight, Ken Sutcliffe reminds us of some of the greatest moments when those who dared won. We begin with what was, for most Australians, the sporting highlight of the year, the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane.
The 30th of September, in the opening ceremony at the QE2 Stadium. The next 10 days were going to be something special. Australia's sporting resurgence was most apparent in swimming. Our best medal tally ever, 15 gold, and a clean sweep in the men's 100 metres freestyle. The bald Ming machines, Neil Brooks and Greg Fasala first and second, with Michael Delaney third. For our girls, elation turned to despair after their victory in the 4x100 metres freestyle relay. Officials ruled that Diana Watts jumped early and we were disqualified. Lisa Curry's 4 gold medals provided some compensation. They made her the toast of Brisbane. Tracy Wickham announced her retirement after winning 2 gold, including the 1500 metres, an emotional moment for a true champion. The entire nation shared in the triumph of Raylene Boyle, also bowing out of international competition with gold in the 400 metres. 25-year-old Robert De Castella captured the public imagination in the marathon, recording the fastest time over 26 miles this year. At the end of competition, Australia led the medal tally from England and Canada, but that hardly seemed to matter during an emotional closing ceremony attended by the Queen and Prince Philip. "1982 saw Kingston Town become Australia's first $1 million stakes winner. He was a sentimental favourite with nearly everyone for the Melbourne Cup, but it wasn't to be.
Goodness, Raiders got up to win the Cup. He came through to beat Kingston Town neck.
The headliner in boxing was the heavyweight clash between champion Larry Holmes and the great white hope Jerry Cooney. After 13 rounds, Cooney was still standing, but Holmes was still the champion. Jimmy Connors brought his pugnacious style to Wimbledon, winning his second championship with a mixture of brute power and determination that John McEnroe just could not match. Connors later went on to win the US Open. Women's tennis was again dominated by Martina Navratilova, who won her 3rd Wimbledon title, and Chris Evert-Lloyd, who took out her 3rd US Open, plus her first Australian championship. 1982's king of golf was undoubtedly Tom Watson. The retiring redhead American won the British Open, and then with this amazing chip in the US Open on the 17th hole, shut out Jack Nicklaus to win the championship. A turbulent year for Formula One motor racing saw the tragic deaths of 2 drivers. Carlo Paletti, killed in a horror smash at the grid at the start of the Canadian Grand Prix, and Gilles Villeneuve died after a crash during practice in Belgium. Brazil's Nelson Piquet startled everyone after being bumped off the track in the West German Grand Prix. But Finland's Keke Rosberg kept his cool to take the World Drivers' Championship. World Cup soccer in Spain provided one of those great victories for the underdog. Italy's attacking football proved too much for the disciplined West Germans. The 3-1 victory was celebrated from Milan to Melbourne's Lygon Street.
This has been an eventful year for the royal family, and there have been some moments the royals themselves might prefer to forget. But among the embarrassments over Buckingham Palace security and a certain prince's girlfriend, there was good news: the arrival of another heir to the throne. William Arthur Philip Louis was born to have greatness thrust upon him. In the natural course of events, he will one day become a monarch, although that accident of birth seemed to impress him not at all. The proud grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had other problems to contend with. All the Queen's horses and all the Queen's men couldn't prevent 31-year-old Michael Fagan making an unsolicited visit to the royal bedchamber. Nor was Commander Michael Trestrail of Scotland Yard much help. He ceased to be Her Majesty's chief bodyguard after confessing to a long relationship with a male prostitute. Fleet Street cast Prince Andrew in 2 roles. First, the royal hero, when he returned from the Falklands. Then, Randy Andy, when he sallied off to the Caribbean with soft porn actress Koo Stark. Undesirous of a palace coup, the Queen brought the affair to an abrupt end. The trauma of the year involved the Queen Mother and a fishbone lodged in her throat. Sections of the press had her at death's door. But at 82, the Queen Mother survived regally. Survival in this remarkable year was arguably achievement in itself. Most of us would hope that in many ways 1983 will be better. In wishing you a happy and prosperous new year, we'll say goodnight with a few more of the memorable moments from the way it was, 1982.
Tomorrow night, we salute the celebrated Nanking Acrobatic Troupe in the first release special, The Acrobats of China. That's at 6:30. But right now, it's time for Kelly, Sabrina and Jill, Charlie's Angels.